Tom Johnson thought his life was perfect until he walked into his own home and discovered his wife Amanda and his stepson Jason in a secret so dark it would shatter everything he held dear. What started as a quiet betrayal quickly escalated into a violent confrontation, and in the aftermath, a family was torn apart forever. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, Tom and Amanda Johnson lived what appeared to be the perfect life. Tom, a hard-working businessman, had built a successful career that allowed him to provide a comfortable life for his family. Amanda, his second wife, was a beautiful woman in her mid-30s, charming and intelligent. She fit into their life seamlessly, taking on the role of a loving stepmother to his teenage daughter, Lily. To the outside world, they were the ideal family. But behind closed doors, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Tom had lost his first wife, Sarah, several years ago to a sudden illness. It had been a devastating blow to him, and for a long time he struggled to move on. But then came Amanda, someone who seemed to heal the wounds he'd carried. She was warm, affectionate, and patient with him, easing his grief and offering him a sense of normalcy. He believed that their marriage was solid, that their love was unbreakable. Amanda, however, had her own history. She had been married before and had a son, Jason, from that relationship. Jason was a handsome 19-year-old, recently graduated from high school, who had moved in with Tom and Amanda after some troubles at home. His relationship with his mother had always been strained, and he had struggled to find his place in the world after the separation. Tom had welcomed him with open arms, hoping to build a bond with him and provide some stability. At first, things went smoothly. Amanda was the glue that held the family together, organizing family dinners and making sure everyone felt included. Jason, although distant and brooding, slowly began to warm up to Tom. They spent time together and Tom made an effort to treat him like a son. For a while, everything seemed fine, but over time subtle changes began to creep in. Amanda, once so affectionate and attentive toward Tom, started to pull away. She became more distant, her mind seeming to wander whenever he tried to initiate a conversation. Her attention seemed divided, her focus often shifting to Jason. Tom attributed this to the pressures of managing the household, especially with Jason's emotional struggles. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Meanwhile, Jason, who had always been a quiet and reserved young man, began to change as well. He became more confident, even arrogant at times, and his behavior towards Amanda began to raise a few eyebrows. There were moments when Tom would catch them in the kitchen or living room, exchanging glances that felt too intimate. Amanda's smiles around Jason were more tender, more affectionate than they ever had been with Tom. But Tom dismissed his growing suspicions, telling himself it was just his imagination running wild. In the meantime, Lily, Tom's daughter, had noticed the subtle shift in the family dynamics too. She had once been close to her mother, Sarah, and she couldn't help but compare the woman she had lost with the woman who had taken her place. Amanda seemed perfect on the surface, but Lily felt something was amiss. She could sense the tension between her stepmother and Jason, and it made her uneasy. What was once a home filled with love and laughter started to feel cold and distant. The walls, once adorned with family photos and memories, now seemed to close in on Tom as he struggled to understand the changes in his wife and stepson. But he couldn't see the deeper, darker connection that was beginning to grow between them, a bond that would soon unravel their seemingly perfect life. As the days went by, Tom continued to ignore the warning signs, not realizing that the most dangerous secrets were being hidden right under his roof. As weeks passed, the subtle tension in the Johnson household grew stronger, and what had once seemed like a minor discomfort now became an undeniable weight on everyone's shoulders. Tom continued to go about his business, unaware of the growing rift between his wife Amanda and his stepson Jason. He attributed the change to normal family dynamics after all. Blending two families was never easy, but Amanda and Jason were hiding something far more dangerous than mere familial tension. Their relationship, which had begun innocently enough, had transformed into something dark and consuming. Amanda's growing attraction to Jason was something she couldn't ignore any longer. It started with small gestures, brief moments of closeness that no one else would have noticed. A lingering touch here, a quiet exchange there. At first it was easy to dismiss. Amanda told herself it was harmless, just a mother comforting her troubled son. But as time went on, those fleeting moments of connection turned into something more intense. Found herself thinking about him in ways she hadn't imagined. It was an attraction she couldn't control, an obsession that gnawed at her. Jason, for his part, wasn't innocent either. At first he had been unsure of his feelings, but he soon realized that Amanda was no longer just his mother. She was someone he desired, someone who filled the void left by years of emotional neglect. He had always admired her beauty and charm, but the closer they became, the stronger his feelings grew. Amanda was no longer just a figure of authority in his life, she was someone he wanted, and he knew deep down that if anyone found out, their entire world would collapse. Their secret bond deepened in quiet moments when Tom wasn't around. Amanda's once welcoming warmth towards Tom now felt distant, cold. She was consumed by thoughts of Jason, and the guilt she felt only seemed to intensify the attraction. The house, once a home full of laughter and conversations, became a place of silence and strained interactions. Every time Tom left the house for work, Jason seemed to fill the space with the tension Amanda couldn't resist. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Tom left for a short business trip. His absence was a relief for both Amanda and Jason, though neither would admit it to each other. The house, once full of Tom's laughter and the clinking of his office papers, was now just the two of them, alone. That night, Amanda and Jason found themselves in the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, but there was no more distance between them. A sudden, overpowering urge pushed them closer. They didn't speak, there was no need. The pull between them was undeniable. The silence in the room thickened as Amanda moved closer to Jason, their eyes locking in a moment of shared understanding. What had once been a forbidden attraction had now crossed a line neither could turn back from. In the hours that followed, they surrendered to the forbidden nature of their connection. The secrecy of it, the danger, the thrill it all made the affair feel like a deadly game, one they both played willingly without consideration for the consequences. They knew it couldn't last. They knew they had to keep it a secret. But the addiction to each other, the heat of their passion, was stronger than the fear of getting caught. When Tom returned the next morning, nothing seemed outwardly different. But beneath the surface, the air between Amanda and Jason was thick with the knowledge of what had transpired. Tom, still unaware, greeted them both with a smile, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His own mind, clouded by work stress, ignored the warning signs. The affair had only just begun, and yet the consequences were already beginning to cast their long shadow over the Johnson family. What had started as a simple attraction was now a dangerous web of deceit, and neither Amanda nor Jason had any idea just how far they would go to protect their secret. One crisp evening, Tom's routine was disrupted. He had been away on a business trip for several days, leaving Amanda and Jason to their own devices. Usually Tom would call or text to check in, but this time something was different. He felt an unfamiliar unease building inside him as he drove back home. Maybe it was just the exhaustion from his trip, or maybe it was the mounting tension he had felt in recent weeks, but something inside him told him to be alert. Tom's instincts had never failed him before, and this time they were sharper than ever. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed something odd. The lights in the house were dimmed, and the atmosphere seemed unnervingly still. Normally Amanda would be in the kitchen preparing dinner, or Lily would be in the living room watching TV, but tonight, everything was silent. He shrugged off the feeling, attributing it to the late hour and his growing sense of fatigue. As he entered the house, his steps echoed in the empty hall. He called out, expecting a response, but there was only silence. A cold draft swept through the hallway as he made his way into the living room. His eyes scanned the room, everything appeared to be in place. However, something in the air felt off. It was as if the house itself had been holding its breath. Tom's mind raced as he walked further into the house. He reached the staircase and paused for a moment. A faint noise from above caught his attention. It sounded like muffled footsteps, the creak of floorboards. He froze, unsure whether it was his imagination or something more. But then, without thinking, he began to climb the stairs. His heart pounded louder with every step, and as he reached the top, the unsettling feeling in his chest grew stronger. At the end of the hallway, the door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar. A sliver of light shone through the crack, and Tom instinctively moved toward it, his steps slow and deliberate. He could hear murmured voices, quiet, almost whispering, coming from the other side. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the doorknob, but before he could push it open, the door creaked, revealing a sight he would never forget. Amanda and Jason were standing close together in the middle of the room. Their faces were flushed, their eyes wide with panic, as if they had been caught in the act. They both turned toward Tom, their shock evident, but there was something else in their eyes, something darker, something that didn't belong in a family. The air seemed to freeze as the truth hit Tom like a thunderclap. He stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what he was seeing. His mind screamed at him, but no words came out. Amanda and Jason, the two people he trusted most, had been hiding something far worse than he could have ever imagined. The realization hit him with a crushing weight. The warmth he had once felt for his wife and stepson now turned to ice as his heart broke, his mind racing to make sense of the betrayal. Amanda's face went pale as she stammered, trying to explain herself, but Tom couldn't hear her. His mind was spinning, a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and disbelief. Jason, standing beside Amanda, had no words either. His eyes flickered between his stepfather and his mother, guilt washing over him, but it was too late to undo the damage. Tom didn't know what to do, his hands shaking with fury and disbelief. He demanded answers, but the more they spoke, the less he understood. There was no simple explanation for what had happened, no words that could ever make it right. In that moment, Tom knew his life would never be the same. The family he thought he had built was a lie, and the love he had once shared with Amanda had been shattered beyond repair. The confrontation left Tom rattled and consumed by rage. He stormed out of the room, the anger boiling within him. He couldn't face them again, not yet. The house that had once felt like home now seemed like a foreign place, its walls closing in on him. Amanda and Jason stayed behind, their silence deafening as they tried to process what had just transpired. But Tom couldn't stay. He needed space, time to think, time to decide what to do next. But what he didn't know was that their secret would lead to even darker consequences, ones that no one could have predicted. The night stretched on, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and the dark thoughts that now consumed Tom. He had left the house in a rush, unable to face the betrayal that had shattered everything he believed about his family. He drove aimlessly, his mind spiraling through a haze of rage and disbelief. The image of Amanda and Jason standing together, their faces filled with guilt, was burned into his memory. Every part of him wanted answers, wanted to confront them, but his emotions were too raw. He knew that if he stayed, something terrible might happen. Hours passed before Tom returned home. It was late, so late that the house had fallen completely silent. The once familiar creaks of the floorboards and the soft hum of the refrigerator were eerily muted. As he stepped inside, the air felt thick with tension, and his mind still raced with anger and confusion. His heart pounded as he made his way through the darkened house. He expected to find Amanda and Jason in the living room, but the silence was overwhelming. No lights were on, no sound, just the stillness of the house that had become a cold prison. Tom's body moved on autopilot as he walked upstairs, his legs heavy with the burden of the confrontation he knew was inevitable. He reached the bedroom door, and before he could knock or speak, he pushed it open. Amanda and Jason were there, standing quietly, their faces ashen and weary. Amanda looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt, fear, and desperation. Jason, standing beside her, was almost unrecognizable, a young man torn between fear of his actions and the sense of invulnerability that had come from his secret with Amanda. The silence in the room was deafening. Tom didn't say a word as he stood in the doorway, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His anger surged, threatening to spill over. It was clear they had been waiting for this moment, bracing for Tom's return, but no one knew how to begin. Amanda opened her mouth trying to speak, but nothing came out. Jason shifted uncomfortably, his gaze lowered to the floor. Tom's mind was still clouded with shock, but the anger slowly started to take over. The betrayal was too great. His own family, his wife, the woman he trusted with everything, and his stepson, the boy he had taken into his home, treated like his own, had broken him in the worst way possible. He couldn't understand why they had done it, why they had let it get this far. The confusion in his head was now replaced with a single, overwhelming emotion: fury. His breath quickened as he stepped forward, his voice shaking with rage. He demanded to know how long this had been going on, how they could have kept such a dark secret from him. Amanda's face fell as she tried to explain, but her words were hollow. Jason remained silent, unwilling or unable to answer. It was clear that nothing could undo the damage, nothing could change what had already happened. The conversation spiraled downward as Tom's anger reached its peak. He felt betrayed by the two people he had loved and cared for most, and his heart felt like it was breaking with every word they spoke. It wasn't just the affair. Tom realized that everything he had believed about his life, his family, had been a lie. It was as if his entire world had crumbled beneath him. Unable to bear the weight of the betrayal, Tom's emotions boiled over. He turned away from Amanda and Jason, storming out of the room in a fit of rage. But something inside him snapped. His anger, once directed outward, now turned inward. He didn't know what he was doing as he grabbed a nearby object from the hallway, a heavy, blunt instrument. His hands shook, his thoughts clouded by the desire for revenge and the overwhelming sense of powerlessness. His anger was no longer just at the affair, it was at everything, at the world, at himself, at them. He turned back to face Amanda and Jason, fury in his eyes. The rage that had been building inside him for so long exploded, and in that instant, everything changed. In a flash of violent emotion, Tom attacked. The reality of what had just occurred began to sink in as the chaos unfolded in a blur of movement. Amanda and Jason, unprepared for the full force of Tom's fury, were caught off guard. Tom's anger was relentless, and in that moment he became consumed by the need to make them feel the weight of their betrayal. It was a moment of horror, one that would haunt everyone involved forever. When it was all over, Tom stood over the aftermath of his actions, breathing heavily, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The damage had been done, but it was only the beginning. What Tom didn't realize was that his life had just been irreversibly altered, and the consequences of his actions would follow him, and Amanda and Jason, for the rest of their lives. The morning after the violent confrontation, the house felt eerily quiet. The chaos of the previous night had left deep scars, but Tom's mind was still reeling, caught in a haze of guilt and confusion. What had started as a rush of anger had spiraled into something far darker, and now he was left to face the aftermath of his impulsive actions. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Tom sat motionless in the living room, his eyes staring blankly at the floor as he replayed the events in his head. The image of Amanda and Jason lying on the floor, bruised and broken, filled his thoughts. He could still hear the echoes of their screams, the shock in their eyes as they realized what he had done. His hands trembled as he thought about how quickly everything had unraveled, how quickly he had let his emotions take control. Meanwhile, Amanda and Jason had not yet fully processed what had happened. They were both alive, but deeply shaken by Tom's violent outburst. Amanda, still in shock, had retreated to her room, unable to face the consequences of her own actions. Jason, more numb than ever, had withdrawn into himself. Both of them were left with the haunting knowledge that everything had changed. They had betrayed Tom, but Tom had betrayed them all in turn. It was a tragic cycle of violence and secrets, one that none of them could escape. As the hours dragged on, Tom's mind began to clear, and reality set in. He knew he couldn't stay in the house, not after what he had done. The guilt gnawed at him, and his thoughts spiraled into a frenzy. He had hurt the people he loved most, and now he had no idea what to do next. The future seemed like a distant dream, clouded by the weight of his own actions. In the afternoon, Tom made his decision. He packed a bag with essentials and left the house, not knowing where he was going or what his next step would be. His world had crumbled, and he couldn't face the consequences of his actions just yet. He needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. As Tom drove aimlessly, the sound of the engine humming beneath him seemed like the only constant. His mind raced with thoughts of Amanda, of Jason, of everything they had lost. He had once thought they were the family he had always wanted, but now, all that was left was brokenness. The love he had felt for them was gone, replaced by a searing rage and the realization that his life would never be the same. Back at the house, Amanda and Jason were left to pick up the pieces. They were physically alive, but the emotional toll of the night had left them both hollow. The affair, the betrayal, the violence, everything had led to this moment, and neither of them knew how to move forward. Amanda, who had once felt so in control of her life, was now lost in a sea of guilt and regret. She had destroyed everything she had built, and the man she had once loved was now a stranger to her. Jason, too, was struggling to make sense of the chaos. His feelings of guilt were overwhelming, but there was also something else: fear. Fear of what Tom might do if he returned. Fear of the consequences they would all face. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As night fell, the house grew colder. The tension between Amanda and Jason remained palpable, but neither of them could bring themselves to speak. They both understood that their lives had been irreparably altered. What had once been a family was now shattered beyond repair. They didn't know what the future held, but they both knew one thing for sure: they would never be able to undo the damage that had been done. Tom, miles away from the house, finally stopped the car in the middle of nowhere. He sat there for a long time, his mind still spinning with a mixture of rage and sorrow. He had hurt them, but in doing so, he had hurt himself too. The family he had once thought he would protect had been torn apart, and in that destruction, he had lost everything. It was only a matter of time before the truth came to light: the police, the investigation, the consequences of Tom's actions. But for now, as the night stretched on, all that Tom could do was sit in the car, consumed by his thoughts, knowing that no matter where he went, the past would follow him. The secret was out, the damage was done, and their lives would never be the same again.